Hello everyone, welcome to the first webinar/podcast of the Center for Professional Selling at Ball State University. My name is Deva Rangarajan and I am the Interim Director of the Center for Professional Selling. I'm thrilled to look at the first webinar and podcast that we're going to be organizing at the Sales Center. And to help us with this, we actually have an alumnus of Ball State University, Mr. Kyle Bushy, who is actually also an entrepreneur, but who began his career in sales. So since this is an entrepreneurial venture within the Sales Center, we thought why not have an entrepreneur come and talk about his experiences in sales and how that helped him become an entrepreneur. So once again, I would like to thank you for tuning in to this podcast/webinar. And what we have is that we're going to have a discussion with Mr. Bushy about some of his experiences. So welcome to Ball State again, Mr. Bushy. Is it okay if I call you Kyle?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, thanks for having me.
Yeah, Kyle, tell us a little bit about yourself. What is your history with Ball State?
Yeah, so I did my undergrad at Ball State. So I started here in August of 2011 with a major in finance. And when I was a junior, I picked up a minor in sales. And it all started because there was an internal sales competition at Ball State, and the winner got $500. And I was a poor college kid like everybody else.
And you were looking at your finances.
Yeah, and I was like, I think I can win a sales competition. And sure and behold, I competed and I won, and a couple of the professors were like, hey, you did pretty good. Have you thought about minoring in sales, and do you want to compete some more? And me being the competitive person I was like, yeah, I'll pick up a minor, why not, and let's go compete more. And that led me to joining Johnson & Johnson in a sales leadership development program when I graduated in May of 2011.
Wow, so it's interesting that you talk about the fact that you were in finance and you went into sales. And actually for some of the audiences out here, you don't make the connect between finance and sales. Now, how did you make that connect in your professional life? I guess when you were a student, maybe you do not make that connect, but how did you do that in your professional life?
Yeah, so I think you're right. They're a very big disconnect. When you think of a salesperson, you don't think of a very analytical, finance-oriented person. Vice versa, when you think of a finance person, you think of a guy sitting behind a computer working in Excel all day, not a guy that's out selling. And I think the connect is really important, though. For sales individuals to hit their number, it's all about managing your business. What your budget is, what the margins are. If you're selling a product where you have control on some of the margins and you can negotiate on the price. So understanding the numbers, understanding the finance, and just how a profit and loss statement works is really valuable. And it helps with the biggest objection, which is cost, right?
Cost, indeed.
Price is an objection for every sale. And so to be able to speak comfortably about the numbers and how they work and why you may have to charge a XY price, and if it increases every year, or what the interest rate is, there's all kinds of pricing objections that come in, and if you don't understand the numbers, you might struggle with that. So I think a finance background is really valuable.
Indeed. That's interesting. So we talked about finance and sales. And you ended up in Johnson & Johnson. And what made you go from Johnson & Johnson to becoming an entrepreneur?
Yeah, so spent a little over 2.5 years at Johnson & Johnson. 12 to 18 months of it was in this leadership rotational program. After that, we kind of graduated and were promoted to an outside sales rep, where I carried a bag for about 9 months and really enjoyed it. After that, there was a decision I needed to move with Johnson & Johnson or stay locally where I was at in Indianapolis, and decided to stay here for personal reasons. Excuse me, and joined a company called MicroEdge, which sold grants management software and fund accounting software for nonprofit organizations. So you think of like the Lilly Endowment, private, corporate, and family foundations, as well as local community foundations, used the software in a variety of ways. Did that for about 2.5 years. And decided I wanted to get out of sales and go back into that corporate world, that finance world that I had studied in undergrad. So I went back to get my MBA. And while getting my MBA at Ohio State, I met a classmate who had a scientific background, and we got to talking, and a couple ideas came from that, and we kind of decided to start our own company. It was more of a project at the beginning, and then we hit a little bit of traction. And once we got traction, we made a decision, okay, do we keep going with the company, or should we focus on getting a real job post business school? And we just kept hitting milestones. And so we finally made the plunge of, hey, we're diving 100% and we're committed 100% to this company. We're giving up the career opportunities that we had post business school, and we started a company that was called Renovo Pharmaceuticals. We had to change our name due to some reasons into Liganex Bio, and that's what it's called today.
Fantastic. Now, it's interesting. So you said you were in sales, you wanted to go back to finance, and you ended up again, in my opinion, as an entrepreneur, but in sales. So which actually is my first question for you and for as well as the audience as well, is that for them to realize is that, do you think there's a lot of similarity between salespeople and entrepreneurs?
So I do. I think there's a lot of similarities. I think there's some differences as well, but a lot of similarities. You know, the first one that comes to mind is both have to be really good presenters and communicators. You know, the best salespeople are great presenters and great communicators. And I think probably the best entrepreneurs are really great at communicating and really good presenters. I also think a big similarity is risk. So entrepreneur, everybody knows, is a very risky career path. That's self-explanatory. But I think sales is a pretty risky business as well. You have to hit your number. You know, if you don't hit your number, not only do you risk not making money, because there are some sales positions that are complete commission, so your life and your quality of life. But if you don't hit your number, you're at risk of being fired. I think more so than most positions. And so I think sales reps and entrepreneurs are willing to take that risk that some people aren't. But I also think another similarity is that they try to diversify risk. So with salespeople, you need to have a large funnel at the top and, you know, narrow it down, because you know you're going to hear no 100 times. And so diversifying your risk with lots of different deals, and then also, you know, reducing your risk of closing a deal. So whether that's an extra meeting, getting you a better price, getting you employee references, customer references, I think it's about reducing the risk so you have a higher probability of closing that deal. Risk mitigation is huge in entrepreneurship. You know, there's a diagram that I wish I could draw, but as your risk goes down in entrepreneurship, your rate of return and your investment opportunity goes up. And so you're trying to diversify risk as an entrepreneur in countless ways, whether that's minimum to no salary for the founders, you're, you know, back to ramen noodles, whatever that looks like. You are, you know, staying in the same hotel room as maybe your co-founder, right? So you're not renting expensive cars. You know, maybe you're just driving to New York for an investment meeting instead of flying, because you can drive for $150 in a day. It's a long day, but you can do it. But 2 plane tickets for you and your co-founders, you know, $700. So there's a ton of different ways that you reduce risk from an entrepreneurial standpoint. Those are, you know, the two that came to my mind. But there are a ton of ways to reduce risk, and I think both salespeople and entrepreneurs are trying to do that.
But it's interesting that you talk about this, because I've also talked to some other entrepreneurs and who have been salespeople as well, is that they talk about the fact that the ability to persuade others, of course, for a salesperson could be within their own organization, whereas there are multiple stakeholders for an entrepreneur, be it your venture capital, be it people that you want to come and work for you. So do you also see that as something similar, the ability to persuade others and bring your vision across as something that's important for sales as well as similar for entrepreneurs as well?
Yeah, absolutely. You know, persuasion is huge, as you mentioned in sales, but as an entrepreneurship, I need to persuade investors of why they should invest in me. I need to persuade my customers, you know, if it's a new product, why they should take a risk on this new company, this new product that isn't very well established. And I need to persuade them why it's better, why, you know, it's worth the risk. Same thing with collaborators. You know, there's a ton of collaborations that go involved. You know, for a small startup, it's great to partner with larger organizations. So you have to persuade those large organizations. You know, why is a Eli Lilly or a Facebook or a Google or whoever it may be, you know, out of their $100 million budgets, why should they take a small chunk of it to help us co-develop a product? And you need to persuade them, and those guys are hard to persuade. You know, they're experts in what they do, and they're really good at it. That's why they work for the great companies that they do. But you have to persuade all of those individuals, and it's you know, the way you persuade an investor is very different than the way you persuade a customer, versus very different than from the way you persuade a collaborator. And so, yeah, presentation skills, the clear and articulate communication, the persuasion is really important.
Because I see a lot of similarities here because of the fact that, yes, as an entrepreneur, you have collaborators, but as salespeople, you also collaborate with your colleagues to go take care of your customers. You have to collaborate, you have to talk to your boss who might have the resources that you will need to take care of your customer as well. So it's interesting that we talk about entrepreneurs and sales, that actually there's a lot of similarities there. But you mentioned something about the fact that differences. So where do you think there are differences between sales and entrepreneurs?
Excuse me. You know, I think to that risk piece, I think there's a difference from that standpoint. Is you're both trying to diversify risk, but it's very, very different kinds of risk.
Absolutely.
As I was talking to earlier at the Entrepreneur Center, as an entrepreneur, you have to be comfortable with losing someone else's money. It's not just your money at stake. Sure, I invested money into our company, but there were other people, friends and family and other investors. And it's really hard to sit down and grasp or think about that, okay, losing your own money kind of stinks and that hurts me, but I'm losing an investor's money. That could have went to their kid's college fund. It could have went to, an anniversary present to their significant other, or whatever those funds could have been used for. Instead, they took those funds and invested in you and your company. And so there's those kinds of challenges that most salespeople don't have to deal with, and I don't think they're comfortable dealing with. Some are, but I think most entrepreneurs have to be comfortable with things like that. Also, most salespeople are really good at presenting and communicating and hitting their number and doing what they're doing, and they really have one focus. And not to say that they can't, branch out and do lots of different things. I think they can, but an entrepreneur has to wear 100 hats at once. At 8 a.m., I'm responding to emails to investors of why they should invest in us, or sending them pro formas about the due diligence process. At 9, I'm talking to a collaborator that we're getting pretty into the weeds about clinical trials that are going to be happening, or preclinical trials that are going to be happening. And at 11 o'clock, I put on a lab coat to go into the lab to hand my business partner, different kinds of instruments while we're doing the preclinical in vitro work. And so you're wearing all kinds of these crazy hats. As for I have friends that work in a couple startups on the technology side, and so they're coding at 2 hours in the morning, and then they're doing their accounting in QuickBooks. And so just the diversity of hats that you have to wear as an entrepreneur is really different than being a salesperson.
Very. I'll be perfectly honest, Kyle, is the fact is I've always only focused on the similarities, but the differences can be pretty big out here, especially when it comes to wearing multiple hats. But of course, from what I hear you say is that actually every entrepreneur has to be a salesperson, but every salesperson need not be an entrepreneur, but they have the makings in them to become an entrepreneur if they choose to.
Yeah, so I think that's exactly right. Every entrepreneur does need to be a salesperson. Every salesperson doesn't need to be an entrepreneur. I think that's very well worded.
Indeed. I think that's what I'm taking away from your conversation as well. That's what we should be looking at. Now, tell me a little bit about, so essentially about your own experience. So you actually finished your job at Johnson & Johnson, then you were starting to work for another non-for-profit, and then now you suddenly get back into the entrepreneurial process. So you're used to working from a sales perspective. So what aspects of it is, how is sales in an entrepreneurial setup quite different than when you work for a big firm?
Yeah, so different in a couple different ways. Assuming you have a product, your startup has a product, the sales process is pretty similar. It's all about needs identification, and then you present and overcome objections, you eventually close your deal. So assuming you have a product, I think it's similar. Your objections are going to be a little different. It's easier to buy a product from Google that's been out there and they're trusted compared to a new software company that doesn't have the reputation. So objections are different, but the process is the same. Where I think the sales process is really different is, raising money, and that's what comes to mind and really sets it apart. Is, if I were to ask you what's the one most important part, and I know all the parts of the sales process are important, as every true salesperson should say, but the one that really sticks out among the others is probably the needs identification part. Because if I don't find out your true pain points, I'm not gonna be able to sell you. I'm not gonna overcome all your objections, and you're not gonna buy from me. When you're raising money to VCs or corporate VCs or whoever you're raising money to, there's not really a needs identification question. I'm going to get in front of you through whatever means necessary. So whether that's a bunch of emails knocking on your door, most of the time it's a warm lead. So you might know my lawyer, or you might know someone on my advisory board, and they're going to introduce us. We'll probably have a quick call, introduction to kind of get to know you. But when I come in and present to you, in that sales meeting, that sales process, I don't get to sit there and ask you a bunch of questions. When the light turns on, it's, why are you going to invest in me? And why are you going to invest in my company? And you have 15, 30 minutes, sometimes an hour if you're farther along in the process to do that. There's no what are you looking for? You know, why would you invest in this management team? Things like that. You obviously do your due diligence, so you know who you're presenting to, but it's all presentation. And then it's objections right there. And then if you get forward and you presented well, then you go through the due diligence process. So I think the steps are a little different. And when I sat back and thought about it, it's really that needs identification process that has kind of gone in that raising money process. And it's just a different style of presentation as well. So it's a different kind of sales process, I think.
So it's a different Kyle?
Yeah.
And every different style?
Yeah, different Kyle and different style.
Absolutely. Now, actually, one of the things which has actually struck me was the fact that you said you graduated in 2011. So if my math is correct, you're a pretty young person. So when you started out as an entrepreneur, again, you have a great idea. You're there in a classroom for an MBA class. Here's an interesting subject. They throw you in to do a project together, and suddenly, voila, the light goes off and say, hey, we have an interesting idea out here. So as a young entrepreneur, what do you think are some of the biggest challenges that you faced?
Yeah, so the two biggest challenges that I think most entrepreneurs face are credibility and lack of experience. And they kind of play hand in hand. Yeah. The credibility is really important. You know, you don't have there's a saying in entrepreneurship, it's you have the gray hair. You know, have you done it before? Yeah. And no gray hair yet, or maybe a few after doing my own company, but none before. And it's, you know, gaining experience, it's how do you build credibility? And so it's going out and getting a good law firm. It's going out and building a really good advisory board. So finding experts and individuals who are experts and very well established in that industry. So, you know, I started the medical company. You know, I went out and found MDs and PhDs that were experts in our space, so they could speak to our credibility. And I was able to find them through our network. If I didn't have them, then we wouldn't have a lot of credibility. You know, what does a 29-year-old MBA know about tissue regeneration? You know, I can't speak to it scientifically, and if I could, it wouldn't be very credible. But you go out and get an MD, PhD who spent the last 30 years in tissue regeneration, now all of a sudden your credibility goes up a little bit. And so it's really establishing that credibility through whatever means necessary. You know, accelerators and incubators, and then obviously investors, you know, is really important. And then the ultimate credibility is, you know, do you have customers? Do you have revenue? Does someone want to pay for your product? But that's much harder than what most people think. It's a lot of you build the advisory boards, you get the credibility through your network, get the introductions to the investors, and then, you know, the ultimate kind of stake in the ground is, hey, you have a product that people want to buy. From the lack of experience, you know, it's hard. It's, you know, I was saying, you know, my biggest fear is not knowing what I don't know. And the example is I didn't know science. So my co-founder is a very scientific, has a scientific background, you know, 15, 16 years in biotech research. I didn't know much about law, so we went out and got a good law firm. I'm not an accountant. I understood finance and can manage our books, but not to the level of a CPA. So I went out and found a really good CPA who specialized in the healthcare market. And so you kind of, you know, stack upon all of these kind of different networks and relationships to build your experience, build your credibility. And then you just learn, you know, it's like drinking from a fire hose or a fire hydrant. From an experience standpoint of learning something new every single day, you probably learn 20 or 30 different new things a day. And, you know, there are ways to overcome it. You know, it's always an objection, but there are ways to overcome it.
Actually, it's great that you talk about going out and finding these kinds of collaborators that you want to work with that you don't necessarily have the skill set yourself. When you do this, what is the kind of investment you're putting into this? Because I'm assuming that at this point in time, if you don't have a product that is still in a viable phase that you can actually go and get customers, where did you find funding for this? Is it something that you also have to learn with the fact that you have to pay for this because you're going to get the time of a lawyer or a CPA, and these people are not going to come for free unless they buy into your idea?
Yes.
How do you deal with this challenge? Because you have loved ones at home. You need to make sure that you don't eat into their, you know what I mean? That you make sure that there's bread on the table and stuff like that.
Yeah, so it's a fantastic question. And I think you know, good entrepreneurs are good at doing a lot of things very cheaply. You run a really lean organization, and we didn't have a lot of money, and you know, we still don't. You know, we haven't raised millions of dollars, and so it's, you know, going out and getting people to maybe work for equity. You know, so getting an advisor and a CPA or a lawyer that's willing to that believes in you and believes in your company, in the product, and then they maybe take, you know, a couple % of ownership in exchange for their services compared to you know, $500 retainer or a $2,000 retainer, whatever it may be, or, you know, $100 an hour fee. That's one way to do it. The other way is to, you know, really get back to selling it and sell your vision of the company and the product and get people to buy into you. You know, and it's taking every meeting possible. I told the story earlier that we went to it was kind of like an accelerator pitch at a local accelerator venture capital firm in Columbus, Ohio. And it was like a 3-day seminar of like how to build a product, how to build a company, what to look for, you know, to get your value statement. And we went, and it was pretty valuable. You know, we were a little farther along in the process than what most people were there, but we met a gentleman who was in the pharma world. And he had actually at one point in time worked at Johnson & Johnson. So we knew some of the same people, but I had never met him. So we got to sit down and talking about it, and he had actually worked in the healthcare space, in the wound healing space, many, many years ago. And so we got to talking and established credibility, and we asked if he would come on board. And so he was excited about it, he was interested, he was bought into the technology, and he was bought into my co-founder and I. So we offered him some equity, and that was kind of his compensation for the services. He went out and introduced us to 2 or 3 people that he had worked with that were experts in the space. We met with them. Some were interested, some weren't. You know, the ones that were interested, we engaged further. They introduced us to people who introduced us to people, and, you know, finally we created this advisory board, and, you know, and built this company off of, you know, all of these networks. And so it's, you know, taking all of those meetings. Anybody that'll talk to you. You know, I always joked around. I'll buy a cup of coffee for anybody who's willing to talk to me that has some experience in this. You know, if it doesn't work out, then, you know, I'm out $3.20. But if it works out, then I'm, you know, might be up you know, an advisor or an investor, or, you know, a new employee in the company.
Wow. It's amazing that it's the job of an entrepreneur is you're in sales, but at the same time there's so much more happening out there, and you're taking a huge risk, but you're selling something that you truly believe in as well. But actually, linked to that is that of all the things that you wanted to be an entrepreneur in, you chose a market or a kind of an industry that is heavily regulated, right? So you do not make your job any easy by going and becoming an entrepreneur, instead of being in the software and the general stuff, to actually going into the medical world where it's much more regulated.
Yeah.
So what are some of your learnings? What would you tell people who are looking into going into a regulated industry, as how the entrepreneurial process is different from what your experience is from other people being from other industries? And the next thing, of course, is that what kind of pieces of advice would you give anybody going into this about the entrepreneurial sales process?
Yeah, so great question. You know, I think it just makes the process longer. You know, which is an obvious answer. You know, the differences are, you know, there are regulations. So in the healthcare space, you know, is it, you know, I have to worry about HIPAA, you know, protecting your personal information. You have to worry at some point in time about insurance coverage. So, you know, how do we get the guys like United Healthcare and Aetna and Cigna to cover our product? And, you know, we were many years away from that because we were still in preclinical trials, but it was a conversation that we had sometimes with investors is this going to be a cash pay product? Is it going to be over the counter? Is it going to be a prescription? And then if so, what's your strategy to get it on, you know, people's insurance plans? And so the objections are different from the sales process. I think that's from an ordinary sales process standpoint, if I was selling software compared to if I was at a pharma company selling pharmaceuticals. The process, you know, same steps in the process. The objections are just a little different. You know, I can buy you dinner in the software industry. You know, I can give you some pins and cool gear. Very, very regulated and not allowed in the pharmaceutical space. You know, I'm able to buy you dinner within certain, you know, criteria, but I can't go out and take you to Ruth's Chris and spend $200 on you, or, you know, buy you know, a nice bottle of wine, or even really leave a pin that says, you know, Liganex or Johnson & Johnson or whatever the pharma company is, name in your office. And so those are differences from the sales process. From an entrepreneurial standpoint, you know, I have some friends that are in the software space that have done, you know, software startups, and they have their own challenges. You know, it's code, and that's one is it's the coding and all of the technology is much quicker. So, a technology today, 6 months from now, it's doubled.
Yeah.
And so it's faster and it takes less time. And so there are definitely challenges in that industry as well. In the pharma industry, in the medical device industry, it's the regulators. There's more boxes to check. Yeah. And obviously you have to get approval of the federal government and the FDA and things like that, which is a more time-consuming process. I think are probably the biggest differences. Hopefully that answered your question. I was a little all over the place there.
No, I think it's one of those things where my main question was, when you do all this, if the medical process is just long and drawn out, I think it takes a special kind of individual to say, hey, I'm going to be an entrepreneur. I'm going to wait till I actually get my first set of customers and pay for it. I think it's fantastic. And actually one of the things which I actually wanted to say was that given the fact that in the regulated space that the sales process or the entrepreneur, I mix it up, but the idea is that you know what I'm saying in terms of the way to go about being successful. And you see that there are long sales cycles. Of course, in medical, that there are certain things which you have to go through the normal process. But for all things under your control, how do you think technology is shaping the sales/entrepreneurial process? Do you think technology is doing anything at all?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I think it makes the process faster. I think it's, everything is about more efficient and more productive, from all aspects. So drug discovery now is, much more efficient than it was, 10 or 15 years ago. Same thing with, technology, right? So our phones are much more advanced than what they were even 3 or 4 years ago, let alone 10 years ago. Well, it was just the 10th anniversary of iPhone, right? So iPhone didn't exist 10 years ago. Yeah, so I think so, where it makes sales reps and companies more efficient. They know who to target. What customer segment is going to spend the most money? Where's the low-hanging fruit? Where's the biggest bang for our buck? I think it's easier to find that. But at the same time, all of our customers and prospects are much smarter. So they can go out to Google and read reviews on your product. And hear hundreds or thousands of good reviews and bad reviews, and they can also get educated on the product. So now you're going into a more educated prospect or client who knows not only more about you, but also more about all the different opportunities out there and the customer and the competitors. And so I think it it makes it more fun, in my opinion. Selling to someone who knows more about the product and is going to challenge me and those kinds of things, I think is exciting than just selling to someone who doesn't know they need it, and you explain to them why and then they buy it. I think so. In short, it makes everything more efficient. It's more productive. Much easier to manage your accounting in QuickBooks than it is an Excel document, things like that. But at the same time, everybody else around you is also getting smarter and more efficient and more productive.
Indeed. Well, Kyle, thank you so much. I know that we will have more questions, but I guess you'll come back again and share more specific answers to more specific questions that we would raise as well.
Yeah, happy to.
But we would really, on behalf of all the Sales Center and everybody else who's going to look at this podcast, we wish you nothing but the best.
Thank you.
We hope that as you proceed further, that you have great experiences, that you come back and share that with us as well.
Yeah.
So thank you very much for your time.
No, thank you. I appreciate it.
Thank you very much.
Yep.
Thanks.